The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, good afternoon and good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you for joining us today for this Osterman Research and Transvault webinar focused on the topic of important considerations when migrating archives to the cloud. My name's Steve Bird. I'm Marketing Manager at Transvault, and I'm just going to talk to you very briefly before handing over to our two industry experts on the line waiting to speak to you. We have got Michael Osterman, Principal Analyst at Osterman Research, and we've also got Steve Douglas, Director of Product Management at Transvault, to talk you through this critical topic, very trendy topic I should say at the moment as well. Do feel free to pop us any questions you've got into the questions pane of the GoToWebinar desktop app, and we'll come back and moderate those and hand them over to the relevant presenter later on in the webinar. I'll be watching out for those, so we look forward to it. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Michael Osterman.
Well, Steve, thank you very much, and I'd like to thank everyone who's here on the call with us and everyone who will be listening to the replay. Just a little bit about Osterman Research so you can appreciate the perspective we're coming from. We are an independent market research and consulting firm, and our focus really is on the way that people communicate or collaborate in a workplace context. So obviously one of the key focus areas for us is archiving, certainly everything cloud, as well as security, encryption, content management, and so forth. We have a very strong emphasis on primary research that we conduct primarily with our own panel, and we'll be discussing a bit of that here today. The company is about 15 years old, and we're based near Seattle, Washington. And sadly, Seattle looks nothing like you see in the photo there. It's quite gray and overcast as it is for most of the year. So let's start out with definitions. Certainly most of us are familiar with archiving and the various technologies related to archiving, as well as the critical importance of archiving for a variety of purposes, and we'll be discussing that here in just a moment. But certainly let's start out with a couple of basic definitions. First, a journal mailbox, which is really standard fare in the Exchange world as well as in a variety of other email platforms. And a journal mailbox is really just a separate mailbox that contains an immutable copy of all of the email traffic that an organization will generate, all of the email traffic into the organization, sent from the users in that organization, and also sent within the organization. The journal mailbox is sometimes called a compliance archive, and it is the primary tool that's used for regulatory and litigation compliance. If you have to search through an email archive, for example for e-discovery purposes, in order to satisfy a regulatory audit, what have you, you go to the journal mailbox because that's the true and accurate copy of all of the relevant email that an organization is going to preserve for either legal or regulatory purposes. And a journal mailbox can really be considered the strategic archive, if you will. It's used for the regulatory and legal purposes to which an organization might have need to go back in many cases for many years. In the United States, for example, typically you'll store email anywhere from 3 to 7 years, but it could be much longer than that. Mailbox archiving, on the other hand, is a much more tactical, user-driven type of archive, where individual users will preserve email for a variety of purposes, maybe just for self-service to an archive, so that they have access to their old presentations, spreadsheets, word processing documents, what have you. And the goal of a mailbox archive really is to maintain a searchable archive on less expensive storage. Traditionally, a mailbox archive was used to transfer inbox data to less expensive storage, so that users would have a mailbox that appeared to be of infinite size, but it allowed administrators to maintain mailbox quotas and the like, so that email systems would run more smoothly. Now, that's still an important issue for a lot of organizations, particularly those that are maintaining on-premises email solutions, but it's becoming less important over time, as we'll see in just a moment. So there really are 5 key reasons to migrate legacy archives, and most organizations today have an archiving solution in place. It certainly can vary. Sometimes it's a journal mailbox, sometimes it's a mailbox archive, sometimes both. But there really are a variety of reasons to take those legacy email archives and migrate them either to a new on-premises archive or more recently to the cloud. First is certainly migration to cloud-based archiving. We are seeing a lot of organizations move to the cloud in terms of their email platforms, and they are moving their archives to the cloud as well. Data consolidation is another important driver. Many times organizations will merge with one another, and they'll have disparate archives, they'll have incompatible archives, and so a lot of decision makers make the decision to migrate their legacy archives to a single cloud-based archive, and in some cases an on-premises archive. Quite often, organizations are looking to upgrade to an improved archiving platform. A lot of the legacy archiving platforms out there really just don't have the performance or the scalability that organizations will need, and so they make the decision to move to the cloud simply because you get better performance, more scalability, better search capabilities, and so forth. Also, improved compliance capabilities are another important driver, particularly for organizations that are going to be facing e-discovery requests or need to do early case assessments and really need to support their litigation efforts with a very robust archive that will allow very good search performance and that will allow them to consolidate all of this content into a single mailbox or a single archive. It's important to be able to have very good search performance so that you're not paying legal staff inordinate amounts to do lots and lots of searches or to take lots of time for those searches. And similarly, improved regulatory compliance is becoming a more important driver for migrating legacy archives as well. A lot of organizations are facing increasing regulatory oversight, and they need the ability to search through vast quantities of email and other information in relatively short periods of time, and to do so as efficiently as possible. So the drivers for archiving are really changing over time, and this comes from our own research, where we've asked decision makers in typically mid-sized and large organizations, about the importance of various types of archiving. And as you can see here, regulatory compliance and litigation support are becoming much more important drivers for archiving over time. Improving storage management is becoming less important, and that's primarily because email is moving to the cloud. Now, certainly that's not to say that all email is moving to the cloud. There's still going to be a very significant proportion of users that are served by on-premises email solutions, but certainly as more and more organizations move to tools like Office 365, Google Mail, and so forth, we're going to see less emphasis on the storage management component of archiving as a primary driver for moving to an archiving system and moving legacy archives as well. So, certainly email is moving to the cloud. What we see here, for example, is that in 2015, about 51% of organizations, based on the research we have done with mid-sized and large organizations, were using some sort of an on-premise archiving system. 21% were served by a cloud-based archiving system, and certainly there's some overlap here. We see some users that are actually served by both. But moving to 2016, we're seeing a decrease in the emphasis on on-premise archiving, and certainly much more emphasis on cloud-based archiving. So we're seeing this general shift toward the cloud for email, for archiving platforms, as well as a variety of other platforms as well. And this general shift is continuing. We anticipate that the majority of archiving platforms or users will be served by some sort of a cloud-based archiving platform over the next several years. So there are some very important questions to consider as you're thinking about moving your data to the cloud, moving your archives to the cloud from the legacy platforms you have today. First, how is your content from these legacy archives going to be ingested? This is a critical consideration, because if you're dealing with multiple terabytes of data and you're needing to migrate this to a new archiving platform, particularly one in the cloud, the way that you archive this, that you migrate this data can be very important. The ingestion can be slow in some cases, depending upon the approach that you take, and if you're moving lots of data over, moving it across the internet can choke bandwidth, and it can be a very arduous experience if you don't have the right tools in place. And what are the functional considerations for transferring data from the old archive to the new one? How are you going to do this from a user perspective? How are users going to be impacted? How is IT going to be impacted? How is legal going to be impacted as you try to migrate all of this data and still need access to it during the migration process? You also need to satisfy a variety of legal and regulatory requirements, maintaining chain of custody of the data, for example, and being able to prove the authenticity of the data in the old archive as well as in the new, and also during the transition period as well. How will end users need to access the archive? They're still going to need access to their mailbox archive during the transition, and you need to ensure that the data is always available, or at least is close to 100% available as it can be. And then there are just a variety of other issues to consider that are dependent upon the email system you're migrating to, the cloud-based archiving system you're migrating to as well. So there are lots of moving pieces here, and it's absolutely important that you set out a very appropriate plan for migrating your legacy archives and maintaining access to those archives during the transition and obviously after as well. So in terms of the approaches for migrating archives to Office 365, what we found in our research is that about half of the organizations we've surveyed, and again, these are mid-sized and large organizations for the most part, would migrate their email archives to Office 365. We find that Office 365 is a very robust platform. It does have some deficiencies relative to certain other third-party cloud-based archiving solutions as well as other on-premises solutions. But a lot of organizations are planning to not only migrate their mail to Office 365, but also to migrate the email archives as well. Most of the remaining organizations really would migrate selected content. They might not migrate 100% of their content to Office 365, maybe for a variety of reasons. They may have solutions that are already in place that they're satisfied with. They may have a lot of legacy data that they really don't touch very often, but that they need to preserve because of legal requirements, because of regulatory requirements, and so forth. A lot of organizations will decide just to maintain the old email archive solution and use Exchange Online or Office 365 only for new content. And a lot of organizations at this point simply aren't sure. They may have decided that they're going to go to Office 365 or some other cloud-based platform, but they're not exactly sure what to do with the legacy archiving data, and so they're going to preserve the old archive maybe, or make a decision at some point to move to the cloud, and they just haven't come to that decision point yet. So really a lot of scenarios for migrating archives to Office 365, and you need an archiving solution and you need a migration solution that's going to allow that level of flexibility. So there are some fundamental differences between archiving in Exchange versus archiving in Office 365. For example, when you're archiving in Exchange, you're using a single instance storage system for purposes of storage efficiency. And Microsoft has done quite a good job here at maintaining the storage efficiency of the archives in Exchange. And all content is stored in a single repository. However, when you migrate to Office 365, you're giving up single instance storage so that Microsoft can scale more efficiently, so that they can transfer data between data centers and so forth. And it is a more efficient way to do things, but it is really a paradigm shift in the way that Microsoft is archiving their content. When you archive to Office 365, the journaled content stores compliance data as metadata in special fields that actually are unique to Office 365. So again, a paradigm shift in the way that things are done in Office 365 relative to Exchange. The content has to be retained for each sender and recipient, and also Office 365 Discovery doesn't recognize where to locate compliance data when it's held in the Exchange single journal message format. And so again, a paradigm shift in the way that things are managed, and administrators have to think differently when they're migrating archived content and managing archives in Office 365. Also, it's important to note that Microsoft's terms of use prohibit the use of a single mailbox to store emails that belong to multiple users. And so again, you have to manage the archives appropriately and consider all of the ramifications of migrating to 365. Now, the archiving capabilities in Office 365 are actually quite good. Again, not quite as complete as they might be in some third-party solutions, but they are getting better over time. And Microsoft has done quite a good job at producing a robust archiving solution for 365, but it is in some ways fundamentally different than what you might have experienced in Microsoft Exchange. So in terms of migrating from Exchange to Office 365, you need to do a variety of things. First, you need to analyze the individual messages in the central journal to determine exactly who the senders are, who the recipients are, and so forth. You need to identify all of those valid recipients in each message and then create individual journal messages by taking each single instance message that's stored in Exchange and creating as many instances of each message as necessary for each recipient. So that, again, is a fundamental shift in the way that content is archived. And then each of the individual messages will then be stored in each recipient's in-place archive or the recoverable items folder, or the REF. So again, a very different approach to archiving in Office 365 than what you're used to in Exchange, but one that actually works better because of the format of Office 365 and the scalability requirements and the scalability capabilities that are inherent in 365. So the advantages of this shift as you move to Office 365 are that it maintains compliance with the Microsoft license agreement, which obviously is a critical consideration. It prevents the most cost-efficient use of Microsoft licensing. It also supports a variety of archive formats. It supports the migration of PST files, emails that are in an MSG format, emails that are in EML formats, and so forth. It also maintains compliance with all of the existing e-discovery tools that you might have in place so that you get to preserve investments in those e-discovery tools instead of having to do a wholesale replacement of them. And it also allows migration of all of the archived content into Office 365 while maintaining chain of custody for that content, maintaining the authenticity of it, and so forth. On the downside, though, storage requirements can increase dramatically because you're not using single instance storage, because you're not using a single journal mailbox. You're basically exploding storage many times in some cases, depending upon the number of recipients of the individual emails that were stored in Exchange and now have to be expanded in Office 365. It requires the use of higher level Office 365 plans, E3 and E5, for example, because of this need for unlimited storage. So in some cases that can drive up the cost relative to Exchange because you do need some of the higher level plans. Also, the ingestion of journal messages can be a relatively slow process because of the increase in storage requirements, and it necessitates a very efficient ingestion mechanism so that you can get all of this content out of the Exchange archives and into Office 365. The result can be bandwidth can be very negatively impacted in some cases. It can take a long time to transfer data over, and Steve Douglas is going to discuss some of the ramifications of this and things you can do to get around the ingestion problems you'll experience in the context of restricted bandwidth. So in summary, there really are a variety of reasons for an organization to migrate their existing email archives. Certainly there's better performance, there are regulatory issues, litigation issues you have to consider, and so forth. One of the most common migration paths that we're seeing today is Exchange to Office 365, and we'll see that accelerate over the next couple of years as more and more organizations are migrating from an on-premises Exchange platform to Office 365. But it does necessitate a fundamental change in the archiving paradigm that most organizations have become used to, and you need a reliable method for managing the migration. And that method exists, and it should seriously be considered. So here is our contact information, and at this point would like to hand things over to Steve Douglas, who will discuss the Transvault solution. Steve, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Michael. Okay, so thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. I'll echo Michael's gratitude that you've all made the time to join us today. I'm going to talk today about the Transvault component to migrations to Office 365, and in particular, of course, this focus on migrating legacy journal archives to Office 365 in a fully compliant way. So what I'd like to add to the content that Michael's given you is a little bit of background about Transvault and myself, my role with Transvault, and then talk about the genesis of our migration solution for taking journal messages from legacy third-party archives and putting them into Office 365 in a compliant way. So as Michael said, my name is Steve Douglas, and you can see from my bio, which I'm not going to bore you with by reading through it all. I'm the guy that's been entrusted to tell you a bit more about Transvault, our cool technology, and to present you with a solution for migrating email archives, especially Exchange-based journal archives, to cloud systems such as Microsoft Office 365. So first a bit about Transvault. We were established in 2006 and we are the inception point for the market of automated email archive migration. And being the first, our tenure and success is unmatched within the marketplace. We were the first archive migration software vendor to be certified by both Microsoft and Veritas, of course formerly Symantec. And we've delivered in excess of 1,200 successful migration projects, with hundreds more projected in 2016 as the race to the cloud continues unabated. And a large proportion of these have been to Office 365. We're helping to unlock a lot of migrations by taking care of the legacy emails, which can actually be a significant barrier to entry for customers who want to take their messaging system into Office 365. It is often that the archive is considered very late in the day, and in some cases the journal archive move to Office 365 is considered even later. So it can be a significant blocker. But to date, we have influenced the migration of approximately 3 million seats of users up to Office 365, so a significant contribution and a significant pedigree. And subsequently, Transvault has a mature and proven product set and support service, and on screen now are just a few of the companies that have trusted Transvault for their migrations most recently. So I'd like to talk now about the solution that we call the Transvault Compliance Time Machine. Our expertise in this area comes as a result of a project between Microsoft and a large UK retailer who approached Transvault with a project to migrate their data from an on-premise archiving system into Office 365, and for this the user mailbox migration was fine. It was a clear, well understood migration path. It's a very common thing that we've been doing to migrate user mailboxes to all kinds of destinations, in particular Exchange and Office 365, which is very comparable to an Exchange migration. And so we were able to take the data from the user's archives, synchronize the messages in the archive with the shortcuts or stubs that are in the mailboxes of the users before migrating their data into the mailboxes or in-place archives as appropriate in Office 365. So this was simple, straightforward. But then came the glitch. There was also a requirement to migrate the single instance journal archive and retain the data in a compliant format. And this was not so straightforward because of the detail of Microsoft's licensing model and their new paradigm for compliance data records in Office 365, which Michael has talked you through so carefully already. So we worked with the Microsoft Products Group for Office 365, as well as the Microsoft Professional Services team, and of course the customer, the end customer whose migration we were delivering, to understand the makeup of the source archiving system and to deliver a migration that ticks all of the boxes for all of the stakeholders. And the approach that we took is to analyze the contents of the single instance journal store before returning a copy of every message sent and received back into the individual users' mailboxes in Office 365. This includes records for users who've since left the organization, also known as leavers in our more common parlance. So it's this critical point of taking one message and returning it to multiple times to all of the senders and all of the recipients in Office 365, and doing so in such a way that the critical compliance data remains available and discoverable once it's in Office 365. And so the feature that we use to migrate these single instance journal archives to Microsoft Office 365, we call the Transvault Compliance Time Machine. The regulatory compliance data is kept intact and fully searchable by Office 365, and the process that we go through makes Office 365 look as if it had been used to create all of the messages in the first place, hence the Time Machine name. It's like going back in time, and instead of implementing your archive, you simply implemented Office 365. That's how your Office 365 system is going to look after a Time Machine migration. And following the development of this niche capability, we've expanded what we now call to what we now call the Universal Transvault Compliance Time Machine. This is the capability to migrate almost any journal archives, single instance message stores to Office 365 to support a variety of different third-party source archives that make use of the Exchange journal format. So you can see a few of the candidate source archives on screen there. And we can do this pretty much for any type of source archiving system. So notes to Exchange is also possible. And it also includes what we call cloud hop migrations, where we take cloud-based journals and also user mailboxes, if that's what's required, from one cloud platform and migrate them into Office 365, another cloud platform, hence the cloud hopping analogy. But there are some risks associated with alternative approaches. So some customers may want to choose to take a more simple approach and simply migrate a journal archive mailbox to a single mailbox in Office 365. So, you know, just taking a single stream of messages in journal envelope format and putting them into what would otherwise be a user's mailbox. But this contravenes the Microsoft licensing agreement. So there are specific regulations within the licensing around being able to move messages from a single instance store with multiple users' data and putting them into a single mailbox in Office 365. Another risk associated with that approach is that a standard journal envelope message, as is found in a standard on-premise Exchange journal or an archived Exchange journal, will not be discoverable if you migrate it directly into Office 365. The journal envelope message that you find in a standard on-premises journal or often in cloud journals contains two parts, and the part where all of the important compliance data is held will not be discoverable to your discovery tools in Office 365 if you move that message in that format. And so the Transvault solution of altering the message metadata slightly to make the compliance data discoverable is going to be the perfect solution. If you simply migrate the journal envelope message, then it's not going to be discoverable. And this causes an increase in litigation risk if you're not able to provide correct evidence of senders and recipients of messages. And there could be industry-specific regulations that require you to be able to access your data in a compliant way. So Michael touched on the need for an increased storage capacity of E3 or above license plans. But the way that our customers are looking at this is the relative cost implication or the cost risk of an unlimited storage plan for Office 365 versus the cost of litigation or fines from regulators for failure to comply. So, in summary, migrating email archives to the cloud requires very careful consideration and planning, some expert migration software, and usually the help of a professional services partner, and Transvault has a global network of performance partners to whom you can turn for your services. A vital aspect of migrating from Exchange-based archives to Office 365 is how to handle an organization's compliance journal, so converting single instance messages to multiple instances in Office 365. And then Transvault is unique in its ability to complete this complex requirement, and there are significant risks associated with alternative approaches. So I'm going to hand back over to my colleague Steve Bird, and he's going to take us through any questions for today's session.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. We've had a couple of questions come in. Do obviously feel free to pop them into the questions pane for me right now, and I will get them over to our speakers. Let's start having a look at some of these. So it looks like this first question is for Michael, and the person is asking, Michael, could you just summarize the advantages of migrating to the cloud in general, in your opinion? I know you had some slides on that.
Yes, there are really a number of advantages. One, you can get potentially much better performance by going to the cloud in terms of search performance, in terms of the scalability of the archive and so forth. And also, one of the fundamental benefits is that you can consolidate multiple archives into a single cloud archive. That can make search more efficient. It can certainly reduce your costs of things like e-discovery and regulatory compliance, because now you're going to a single source. And also, depending upon the cloud archiving provider that you choose, you can choose, not to use the term future-proof, but you can choose a cloud archiving vendor that will allow you to start integrating other content types beyond email that you might need in the future. Things like social media posts, text messages, what have you, all content that might be relevant in the context of e-discovery, regulatory compliance, and so forth.
Excellent. Thank you, Michael. Yeah, particularly on that point about consolidation of disparate archives, it's particularly pertinent when you've been in a company that's been through mergers and acquisitions, where company A has got one type of archive, company B has got a different type of archive. Suddenly you're in a situation where it'd be great to be able to, as Michael says, consolidate that data, and migrating to cloud systems like Office 365 is certainly a great point in time to be able to do that. We've had some more questions rolling in. These ones look a bit more relevant for Mr. Steve Douglas. Steve, how are Transvault's products priced, please?
Well, probably let's focus specifically on our Migrator product, which is the product that contains our journal migration to Office 365 capability. We have a pricing scale that's delivered by the amount of data in the source archiving system. So we price per terabyte of data. And we have a descending scale, so the more data that you have to move, then the economy of scale kicks in terms of the pricing. For a detailed understanding of our pricing, the best thing to do is to reach out directly to Transvault, and we will discuss with you the nature of your requirements. And as I mentioned, we work with a global network of migrations partners who are the direct vendors of our software, and they can then, we can hand over your opportunity to them, and they can take you through the detail of what it is that you want to achieve in terms of your archive migration, users, and journal, and they can give you the detailed pricing.
Excellent, thank you. This next person is asking about what performance they can expect when they're migrating data up to Office 365, and is there impact on, I guess, bandwidth within their network?
Yeah, that's a really good question. The short answer is there is no right answer to that question. There are a myriad of factors that are going to affect the performance of a migration to Office 365, not least the performance of the connection up to Office 365 and any throttling that gets applied by Microsoft. One of our big tips would be, if you're going to migrate to Office 365, then raise a support ticket with Microsoft straight away to ask for the throttling to be removed on your migration so that you can improve your ingestion performance. That's going to be where the bottleneck is most likely to lie. But when you're migrating to Office 365, we use a technology that we call Transvault Cloud Stream. Again, this is a piece of development work that we did in conjunction with the products team at Microsoft so that we can work out the very best ways to ingest data into Office 365, but also to work with them to work out the loopholes, the ways that we can get around their best practices for protecting their system, I guess, to maximize the ingestion capability. And part of that mechanism includes a capability that we call traffic flow analysis, and that allows us to make clever decisions on the fly about how we're going to migrate the data into Office 365 so that it minimizes the impact on your network. Of course, ultimately what you want to achieve is the fastest possible migration speeds, but delivered against a migration that gives you the optimum in terms of your return on investment from Office 365, and that's going to include this explosion of your journal data back into individual users' mailboxes. So, you know, it's all about doing clever migrations and making sure that you optimize the way that the migration goes.
Excellent, thank you, Steve. One final question for you, sir, which is, this person says, we've got a Mimecast hosted archive that I believe handles our journal. Can we migrate that to Office 365?
Well, the answer to that's very simple. Yes, you can. So if you get in contact with Transvault, again, we can understand the specifics, the detail of your project. We can introduce you to one of our performance partners who will be able to manage that migration for you. And yep, you'll be able to do that in a fully compliant Transvault compliance time machine style migration into Office 365 and get the benefits of that cloud hop.
Fabulous, thank you. Yeah, that's the type of migration we call cloud hopping, and it's happening more and more as people look to consolidate and to get all their data in one place in Office 365 where it's all discoverable and searchable. Do keep your questions coming in to us. I've got one more in the bank which appears to be for Michael. Quite simply, can I get a copy of the slides, please?
Yes, absolutely. We'd be happy to provide that. And we also have a white paper we've produced for Transvault that goes more in depth on the issues we've discussed today, and we'd be happy to provide that as well.
Excellent, thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, this webinar content has really been a summary of that white paper that's been authored by Osterman Research. So you can download that by using the link that you see in front of you now. Obviously, get us at gotransvault@transvault.com, and we can also deliver you that white paper and talk about any migration requirements you might have, either for yourselves or for customers out there asking you for projects. Let's just check if we've got any more questions rolling in, but I think we're now at the end of them. So thank you for all of those. And again, I'd like to thank Michael Osterman of Osterman Research and Steve Douglas of Transvault for talking through important considerations when migrating archives to the cloud, and in particular that paradigm shift between Microsoft Exchange, journal archives, single instancing, and how Microsoft Office 365 has changed that. Lots to think about, but also lots of options for you, particularly using Transvault. So do get in touch with us. Thank you for attending again today, and we'll look forward to speaking to you in the very near future.